The sun had barely risen over the quiet town of Nyeri, Kenya, when disaster struck. Xanderz, a hard-working civil engineer with dreams of building his own construction firm, left the house early that morning to inspect a faulty bridge project in the hills. His wife, Wanjiku, kissed him on the cheek, reminding him to pick up groceries on the way back and to call her if anything delayed him. They had been married for 5 years, their union a storybook blend of ambition, partnership, and tender love. But beneath the surface, Wanjiku's patience had begun to thin. Unspoken frustrations from years of sacrificing her career in fashion design to support Xanderz's dreams. Just as Xanderz leaned over the faulty concrete slab, it gave way beneath him. He tumbled down 10 feet, hitting his back against steel rods before landing hard. The pain shot through his body like fire, and though his crew rushed to rescue him, the damage was done. The hospital confirmed the worst. Xanderz had suffered a severe spinal injury. He would never walk again. The days that followed blurred into a fog of hospital rooms, pity-filled eyes, and a silence that grew louder in Wanjiku's heart. She stayed by his side for the first few weeks, feeding him, wiping his tears, and whispering reassurances. But every time she looked at the wheelchair parked beside his hospital bed, something in her chest tightened. The man she had married, strong, ambitious, a dreamer, had vanished, replaced by a fragile shadow of his former self. The doctors encouraged therapy and adaptation, but Wanjiku saw only a future filled with caregiving, diapers, and a shattered life that offered her nothing in return. Guilt gnawed at her, but resentment roared louder. One night, as Xanderz cried silently in pain, she sat outside the hospital, scrolling through her phone, and paused at a message from his best friend Kamau. Kamau had always lingered too long around her, and now his comforting words seemed more seductive than ever. That night, she didn't return to the hospital room, and 3 months later, while Xanderz was still in rehab, Wanjiku packed her things, signed divorce papers without a word, and married Kamau. It sent shockwaves through their circle. Xanderz, devastated and humiliated, felt more broken than his legs ever made him. He watched everything crumble, his wife, his best friend, his life, vanish like morning dew under a harsh sun. Xanderz sat on the veranda of his late mother's rural home, watching the sun bleed into the horizon like a wound slowly closing. It had been 6 months since Wanjiku left him, and 3 since Kamau had taken her as his wife. The betrayal still throbbed inside him like an open sore. The man who used to call him brother now lived in the city house he built, wore his colognes, and held the woman he once dreamed of growing old with. What pained him more wasn't just the abandonment, but how easily they both discarded him, as if his worth vanished the day he could no longer walk. But Xanderz wasn't a man to wallow for long. He had spent the early weeks after rehab staring at the ceiling, too numb to cry, too broken to speak. Then one day, a nurse handed him a book on entrepreneurship. Something sparked. He realized that while his legs had failed him, his mind remained unshaken. If he couldn't build bridges anymore, perhaps he could build lives, his own first. With his savings nearly drained, he started small, offering consultancy services to rural contractors and mentoring engineering students virtually. Word of his brilliance began to spread. Soon, companies that had once ignored his calls began seeking his advice. His sharp mind, reputation for integrity, and first-hand knowledge of safety risks made him a valuable asset. A local nonprofit offered him a grant to develop an affordable housing blueprint for disabled persons in remote areas. That project gained national attention, and slowly, journalists, sponsors, and disabled advocacy groups rallied around his efforts. Xanderz's name was no longer whispered in pity, but spoken with reverence. Meanwhile, Kamau and Wanjiku's marriage began to fray at the edges. The romantic thrill that had pulled them together waned once reality set in. Kamau, a man used to having things handed to him, was ill-equipped for the responsibilities of marriage. And Wanjiku soon realized that being with him was like trying to light a fire with damp wood. He lacked Xanderz's vision, patience, and depth. Regret slithered into her heart like smoke from a dying fire. Yet pride kept her from reaching out. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. Wanjiku sat before a grand vanity mirror in their upscale apartment in Kilimani, swiping layers of foundation onto her tired skin. On the surface, she had everything she once thought she wanted: luxury, attention, and freedom from caregiving. Yet, the silence in her marriage to Kamau was more deafening than the hospital walls she once escaped from. The laughter had dried up, the intimacy was performative, and the sparkle in Kamau's eyes when he looked at her had been replaced by annoyance. He spent most of his days at the bar, bouncing from one business idea to another without structure, returning home only to sleep or quarrel. Their conversations had become cold exchanges of obligation, not affection. What haunted Wanjiku most were the small things. How Kamau never held her gaze when she spoke, how he mocked her interest in starting a fashion boutique, and how he casually referred to Xanderz's success in jest. She pretended not to care, but each time Xanderz's name trended on social media for another award or keynote speech, her chest tightened. In her attempt to escape a crippled man, she had chained herself to an emotionally crippled one. Meanwhile, Xanderz's influence rippled far beyond what he could have imagined. He was now a regular guest on national radio shows, using his voice to advocate for accessible infrastructure and inclusive policies. Though he still used a wheelchair, the world no longer saw him as disabled. They saw him as a force of nature. He had started a non-profit foundation called Rise from Ruin that provided training and scholarships to physically challenged individuals. His story became a case study at the university where he once lectured part-time. Yet with every accomplishment, his heart bore a quiet ache. A longing not for Wanjiku herself, but for the life they might have had she stayed and believed in him. He had healed outwardly, but scars remained. At night, he would sometimes scroll through old photos. Wanjiku laughing at their wedding, Kamau giving a toast as his best man. He would then close his eyes, take a deep breath, and whisper, "Thank you for leaving. It forced me to rise." Though he had no bitterness left, he also had no room in his heart for either of them. His only focus now was the empire he was building. An empire born not from pity, but from pain refined into purpose. Kamau leaned against the counter of their kitchen, sipping his third bottle of beer that afternoon. His business had failed again, some shady investment in imported auto parts, and he had begun pawning off furniture just to cover debts Wanjiku knew nothing about. He watched her pace the living room, adjusting the curtains for the third time in 1 hour, clearly restless. She had been withdrawn lately, less interested in outings, more absorbed in reading articles about fashion startups, and occasionally, he'd catch her watching Xanderz's interviews. Each time, a bitter tension would swell in the room. "Still obsessed with your ex?" He'd mock with a dry laugh, masking his insecurities with sarcasm. Wanjiku wouldn't respond anymore. Her silence was louder than her words. In truth, she was unraveling inside. The life she had imagined with Kamau, full of thrill and affection, had deteriorated into one of regret, resentment, and quiet humiliation. She had given up a man who was loyal, visionary, and dependable, for one who offered only fleeting excitement and constant disappointment. And now, even that excitement had withered. Wanjiku's restlessness soon grew into desperation. She tried launching her boutique with what little savings she had left, but Kamau discouraged her at every turn, saying she should focus on being a wife, not a dreamer. That stung. Xanderz, in contrast, had always encouraged her passion, even offering to fund her fashion diploma before the accident. The comparisons gnawed at her daily. She once believed Kamau's love would liberate her, but instead it had caged her. She found herself avoiding friends who used to envy her lucky escape from caregiving, because she now felt ashamed. Her loneliness became suffocating. One evening, after Kamau left the house in another drunken stupor, Wanjiku scrolled through her messages and hesitated at Xanderz's number. She hadn't reached out in years. Her finger hovered over the send message button, trembling, but something stopped her. Pride, guilt, fear of hearing what she already knew. That he no longer needed her, that he had truly moved on. So she tucked the phone away and sat on the couch, staring at the emptiness she had once mistaken for freedom. All the designer clothes, dinners, and flashy vacations could not fill the void. Kamau had won the prize, but the prize was rotting in his hands, and Wanjiku was starting to suffocate in a throne built on betrayal. The annual Nairobi Philanthropy Gala was the kind of event that attracted Kenya's top minds, celebrities, and powerhouses. This year, the spotlight was even brighter because of one keynote speaker, Xanderz Muriuki, the founder of Rise from Ruin. The invitation-only event was broadcast live on national television, and attendees paid hefty donations to secure tables. Xanderz arrived in a sleek, customized black SUV, flanked by 2 assistants and his protégé, a brilliant young woman in a red power suit who had once been homeless before his foundation sponsored her education. When he rolled into the ballroom in his designer suit, dignified and calm, all heads turned in admiration. Camera flashes lit up like fireworks. The man who was once pitted now commanded attention and respect. His speech was moving. He spoke of resilience, betrayal, forgiveness, and how life's lowest points often disguise life's greatest launches. The audience rose in applause. Watching from her television screen at home, Wanjiku sat frozen, remote in hand, her eyes filled with disbelief and envy. The world was clapping for the man she thought would never rise again. Later that night, Kamau stumbled into the house smelling of whiskey, his shirt half-buttoned and his eyes red. "Did you see your ex on TV?" he slurred, throwing himself onto the couch. "He thinks he's a hero now." Wanjiku said nothing. There was no point arguing with a man who couldn't see beyond his own failure. The bitterness in Kamau's voice betrayed his own festering regret. Watching Xanderz's rise had become a recurring thorn in his pride. He had believed that stealing his friend's wife would give him power, but all it gave him was a constant reminder of how far below Xanderz he remained. Wanjiku, meanwhile, felt a deep ache inside her. The man she had left in a hospital bed had not only healed, but evolved into something extraordinary. And she, the woman who once believed she deserved better, now lived with someone who ridiculed greatness out of insecurity. That night, she couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling and whispered to herself, "I chose wrong." In chasing the illusion of a better life, she had abandoned the one man who had been real, loyal, and full of promise, even in his darkest hour. And now, her past had grown into something so bright it burned to look at. 2 months after the gala, Xanderz received an invitation to speak at an exclusive international conference on inclusive urban planning, hosted in Cape Town, South Africa. His foundation's innovative housing model had gained traction across East Africa, and global donors were beginning to take notice. As he wheeled through the luxurious conference hall, dignitaries from various nations lined up to shake his hand and commend his work. A media house from Nairobi followed him, documenting his journey for a short film titled "The Man Who Rose from Ashes." One of the interviewers, a striking young journalist named Muthoni, had been assigned to follow him during the trip. What began as a professional interaction slowly grew into something warmer. She admired his vision and was moved by his story. One evening, as they shared dinner on the hotel rooftop, laughter slipped between bites, and for the first time in years, Xanderz felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since the accident: connection. It wasn't forced or dramatic. It was organic and healing. Back in Nairobi, Kamau's debts had caught up with him, He had been borrowing under the pretense of investing in a transportation company, but the venture collapsed before it even started. One afternoon, two well-dressed men knocked at the door. Wanjiku opened, only for them to hand her a letter, notice of asset repossession. Kamau emerged moments later and tried to chase them off, but the damage had already been done. That night, they argued like never before. Plates shattered, words cut deeper than knives, and in his drunken rage, Kamau yelled, "You were never worth leaving him for." The sentence echoed through the apartment like thunder. Wanjiku stood still, eyes wide, heart hollow. She had thought the worst thing that could happen was losing Xanderz. But now she realized the true tragedy wasn't losing him. It was choosing someone so empty, he couldn't even see her worth without comparing it to the man he betrayed. The next morning, she quietly packed a suitcase. She didn't know where she was going yet, but she knew she couldn't stay. The shame, the bitterness, the regret, it had become unbearable. She had traded a diamond for broken glass, and now her hands were bleeding from trying to hold it all together. Wanjiku moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Nairobi. The silence was heavier now, but at least it was her own. She spent her days working part-time at a textile shop, and her evenings sketching designs she hadn't touched in years. The boutique dream had long been buried under regret, but now, as her hands moved across fabric, a flicker of purpose began to reawaken. Still, she couldn't escape her past. Every news article about Xanderz's success seemed like another reminder of her failure. Not just in choosing Kamau, but in abandoning love when it looked inconvenient. One night, unable to sleep, she sat at her desk and began to write a letter. Not to rekindle love, but to release the guilt she had locked inside for years. Her hand trembled as she wrote, "Dear Xanderz, I don't expect you to forgive me, and I certainly don't expect you to respond. I just need to say this. For me, I left you at your lowest, and nothing in this world excuses that. I thought I was saving myself from a hard life. I didn't know I was walking into something much worse. Kamau wasn't you. He never could be. I see that now, and I regret not staying by your side, not because of who you've become today, but because I forgot who you already were. I'm sorry, truly." She never sent the letter. She folded it neatly and placed it in her journal, a sealed confession between her and her shadow. That same week, she saw photos from Xanderz's Cape Town conference online. In the pictures, he was smiling, truly smiling, beside a woman she didn't know. Her name was Muthoni. The two looked comfortable close. Something inside Wanjiku twisted painfully, but she forced herself to smile. It was time she stopped clinging to a chapter she had torn from the book herself. Regret would always live with her, but she didn't have to live in it forever. She turned the page of her sketchbook and began drawing again, this time with firmer strokes. Somewhere out there, Xanderz had rebuilt. She would try to do the same, even if hers was a slower climb, even if she would always walk with the echo of what she lost. A year passed, and Nairobi buzzed with excitement over the grand opening of the Rise from Ruin Innovation Center, a multi-million-shilling hub for training, mentorship, and rehabilitation services for disabled youth and entrepreneurs. It was Xanderz's most ambitious project yet, and it stood tall in the heart of Westlands, a towering symbol of resilience and redemption. The president was expected to attend the unveiling, alongside top stakeholders from across Africa. Xanderz had worked tirelessly to bring this vision to life. And now, with Muthoni, his partner in both business and life, by his side, he stood at the podium, not as a victim of life's cruelty, but as a conqueror of it. The crowd applauded as he delivered his speech with steady poise, voice clear and firm. "What was meant to break me," he said, "became the foundation of something far greater than I ever imagined." Behind him, the giant letters of the center's name shimmered in silver and gold. His journey, once punctuated by abandonment and betrayal, had led to something no one could take away: purpose. Among the spectators that day was Wanjiku, quietly seated in the back row, behind a pair of sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat. She hadn't planned to attend, but a friend from the textile shop had invited her without knowing her connection to Xanderz, and curiosity overcame her better judgment. As she watched the ceremony unfold, tears slid down her cheeks, not from jealousy, but from a strange mix of grief and admiration. Xanderz didn't see her, and she didn't try to approach him. She knew now that some chapters are best left closed. But still, she stood up and clapped as he unveiled the plaque. She clapped hard, with the strength of someone who had learned the weight of regret. Later that evening, back in her small flat, she framed the sketches she had completed for her upcoming fashion exhibit, her first solo one. It wasn't the life she once chased, nor the one she threw away. It was a new life, humble, honest, and slowly healing. And as she turned off the lights and looked at her reflection in the mirror, she whispered, "You're not there yet, but you're on your way." Kamau's fall from grace had finally reached rock bottom. After several lawsuits, mounting debts, and public humiliation, he was evicted from the apartment he once mocked Xanderz for losing. He now lived in a cramped single-room lodging on the city outskirts, far from the glitz and ego that once propped him up. His drinking intensified, and his name had become poison in business circles. Once the charming best friend who stole another man's wife, Kamau was now the cautionary tale whispered in bar corners. He would often sit alone, watching YouTube interviews of Xanderz, fuming with bitterness that had nowhere else to go. In his darkest moments, he'd talk to the walls, muttering apologies no one would ever hear. One day, broke and desperate, he stood outside the Rise from Ruin Center with a crumpled job application form in his coat pocket. He had lied on the form, of course, claiming rehabilitation experience and a degree he never completed. But as he stood at the gate, unable to bring himself to walk through it, the security guard asked, "Are you here for help or to help?" Kamau turned away in shame, tears stinging his eyes. At that same hour, across town, Wanjiku stood on a small stage inside a modest art gallery. Her fashion exhibit, titled Second Chances, had drawn a decent crowd. A local journalist interviewed her after the show, asking how she found her inspiration. "Pain," she said simply, "but also hope." Her designs had been deeply personal, reflective of her journey through betrayal, loss, and rebuilding. She didn't name names or play the victim. Instead, she used fabric, color, and texture to tell a story of growth. After the event, a woman from a design institute approached her with a teaching offer. It wasn't glamour, but it was a door she never thought would open again. That night, alone in her room, she looked through her old journal, the one with the unsent letter to Xanderz. This time, she didn't cry. She smiled. Her pain had a place now, one that served others. And even though she still thought of him sometimes, how strong he was, how far he had come, she didn't wish to undo the past anymore. She understood now. Some mistakes are irreversible, but what you do after them determines whether you stay broken or become better. Kamau had drowned in his shame. She had chosen to swim. 2 years had passed since the gala, and the Rise from Ruin Center had expanded into 3 counties, with a growing team and several sponsored fellows now leading their own initiatives. Xanderz, though still humble, had become something of a national treasure, an advocate not just for the physically challenged, but for anyone who had ever been broken and rebuilt themselves. He and Mathoni were now married in a quiet, intimate ceremony held in the courtyard of the center, surrounded by students and beneficiaries whose lives had been touched by his. There were no grand speeches, no flashy vows, just 2 people who had found healing in each other, promising to build the future hand in hand. Xanderz no longer looked back. He had forgiven Wanjiku in his heart long ago, not because she asked for it, but because his peace depended on it. He had learned that true strength wasn't just in walking again. It was in moving on without bitterness. And as he gave his first public address as a married man, he said simply, "Everything that left me made space for what I was meant to become." Meanwhile, Wanjiku, standing behind a stall at a local creative fair, zipped up a customer's garment bag with pride. Her small fashion line was finally gaining traction. She now trained underprivileged women in tailoring and design, helping them earn a living. It wasn't the glamorous life she once imagined, but it was authentic and more fulfilling than anything she'd known with Kamau. She hadn't heard from him in months. Rumor had it he had left the city and was working odd jobs upcountry. She didn't chase him. There was nothing left there to heal. One afternoon, she received a parcel with no sender address. Inside was a copy of a newly published book titled Rise from Ruin, a true story of triumph. On the title page, in neat handwriting, were the words, "Pain refines. Purpose redeems." And Wanjiku clutched the book to her chest, eyes wet but smiling. It was not a message of revenge. It was a benediction. She stood for a long time beneath the Nairobi sun, not in shame anymore, but in quiet acceptance. Her journey had cost her more than she imagined, but it taught her something priceless. To never abandon someone just because they're in a valley, because you might be walking away from a mountain in the making. Thanks for watching, family. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notifications for more exciting stories from us. Also share this story with your loved ones.